I'm also very pleased to be here with Rafael, whose work I admire. Rafael, it must be said, shares with Ungers one very important privilege. He's not only an extraordinary designer and builder, but he's also an intellectual. So I think it's important to hear Rafael today, who has written for years on architecture from the Reconquista in Spain to the present days, and who has a fantastic eye on current architecture and architects. So it's really a big challenge to be speaking here tonight. So let me start with my presentation. I don't know if I should get it away from this opening screen. Yeah. Of course, it is not the single most popular book commercially of this 20th century. Probably the world record of popularity and of sales is Ernst Neufert's Bauentwurfslehre, first published in 1936, and which has sold more than 500,000 copies in more than 45 languages. So, and this record is hard to break. But the complete work of Le Corbusier are amongst a very small number of books whose worldwide impact has been significant. His Okay, so back to Le Corbusier. The œuvre complète of Le Corbusier, the Gesamtes Werk, the complete works, has been published initially during his lifetime in 7 volumes, and one posthumous volume, an 8th volume, has been published. They've been widely reprinted from 1930 to this day, and they have for many years been the main source of information available on the architectural production of Le Corbusier before the opening and the interpretation of the enormous archive in Paris, an archive which has completely changed the perception and the history of Le Corbusier's project, and confirmed that much of what had been published, in particular in the first volumes, was more fiction sometimes than reality. The system which is created by Le Corbusier in the first part of his life to disseminate his work is a double one. On one side, manifestos and pamphlets, those of the collection of L'Esprit Nouveau, which was opened in 1923 with 2 words, an architecture. And here you see a sort of publicity page in the complete works of the first volume of the Gesamtes Werk of 1930, published in Zurich in 1930, under the heading, which you can hardly read, Le Corbusier als Autor, Le Corbusier as an author. And here I think one finds a parallel with Rem Koolhaas. Like Koolhaas, Le Corbusier's fame started with a book. Before almost any one of his projects was circulated. Vers une Architektur on one side, and of course Delirious New York on the other side. But very quickly, since his work was developing, Le Corbusier was moved into the creation of a livre album, of a book as an album, and the preparation of these albums will mobilize the office during 4 decades. But here, instead of looking at the entire series, I wanted to focus on the first volume and its origin and its making and some of its developments. And it's a story which is not well known, almost, I would say it remains rather obscure, because the answer cannot be found only in the archive of Le Corbusier. The origin of this bestseller can be rebuilt with a certain precision. And the first astonishing fact is that Le Corbusier was not the initiator of this book. He was not the originator of the book. And it's quite amazing when one takes the measure of what I would call Le Corbusier's passion for books. He has built 75 projects, some of them with many units like Pessac, but he has also published 45 books. So when you realize that he had a passion for books, it's interesting to see that this project came out from the work of an architect he deeply disliked, not Frank Lloyd Wright, but the guy who was behind this book. This book was published in 1928 in Paris. It was the first book by the young historian Henry Russell Hitchcock. And the originator of the book was an architect called André Lursa, who was one of the major French modernists in those years, and one of those who had a very close connection, by the way, with Germany. Lursa was a rival, was very jealous in respect to Le Corbusier. He had good reason, he was, to be jealous. He was good, but not as brilliant as Le Corbusier, and this made him angry. So he, in parallel to his work as an architect, he advised the journal Cahiers d'Art to publish monographs, one on Frank Lloyd Wright, another one on J.J.P. Aude. And a young architect, a young Swiss architect, by the name of Willy Bösiger, you see him on, during a feast in Zurich in 1929. Willy Bösiger, dressed as a sailor here, no, or as a sort of hoodlum, and Stanoff on the left, an architect who was born in Frankfurt and had been trained in Zurich, were both working with Lursa, and they had both worked on the layout of the Frank Lloyd Wright book. In 1929, and this is an information I've gotten from Willy Bösiger, whom I interviewed in Zurich in the mid-1980s, and it's confirmed by the correspondence. Bösiger and Stanoff met in 1929, a third guy, the Zurich publisher Hans Giersberger, and proposed him to start a series of monographs on new Paris architects with Le Corbusier and Lursa. Giersberger had already met Le Corbusier in Zurich in 1927 and had published several important books on the Swiss scene, like Peter Mayer's book, Moderne Architektur und Tradition. The two friends, together with the third one, the Italian young architect Giovanni Vedres, who was also working with Lursa, contact Le Corbusier in 1929 and write to him, I found the letter, an important editor is proposing us to publish your complete works. Already in April, a first agreement is achieved on the structure of the book. Bösiger, Stanoff and Vedres try to reinsure Le Corbusier, who was probably a little worried as they were very close to Lursa, saying that the book will not contain any critique, any critical views, because it will be the publication of the work of a master, I'm quoting the letter, by young architects who are his admirers. Giersberger is supposed to print a French version for Zervos, for the publisher of Cahiers d'Art. And Le Corbusier insisting very much on the parallel printing of a French and a German version. We'll see that this won't happen. Before putting itself at work, the trio, Stanoff, Bösiger, Vedres, has to get rid of the idea of publishing the book by Lursa. And so they start working on the complete works of Le Corbusier and Jeanneret, which is supposedly going to happen in October 29, with a book on Lursa a little later. But without waiting for Giersberger to do the book on Lursa, the book on Le Corbusier is put on track and the agreement is broken. So Lursa throws Stanoff away from the office, and the contact with Bösiger is also lost. Bösiger will later return to Zurich, and Stanoff will move to America and Philadelphia, where he will become one of the office partners of Louis Kahn, and a very important city planner and architect in Philadelphia. And as a result, Lursa publishes his own book, a portfolio published by Vincent Fréal in 1929 on his own. And Le Corbusier starts working with Gersberger. You see on the right a letter, one of the first letters about the contract between Gersberger and Le Corbusier. But things are not very smooth, and here we have to realize that Le Corbusier was one of the first flying experts in architecture and city planning. He was never in Paris, and in a way leaves the control of the book to his partner and cousin Pierre Jeanneret. He's also worried with the translation of the German text, which is written by Stonnerhoff, and proposes to invite Hans Hildebrandt, the art historian, who had already translated, with major mistakes by the way, towards an architecture. And considering that Hildebrandt is lost in the questions and the language of the profession. So he doesn't understand architecture, but nonetheless he trusts him to control the text of Stonnerhoff. He also thinks for a moment to give this job to the third guy on this picture, Siegfried Gideon, who has a sort of minor part in all of this. In a way, but Stonnerhoff is very slow at producing the text, and in the end the book is not ready as it was meant to be for the second Congress, second International Congress of New Architecture, which takes place in Frankfurt in October of 29. And Zervos is very nervous about publishing a French version in this context, and in the end drops this idea. So the amazing thing is that for 7 years, until the publication of a French version, the only available version, I think something that people don't realize, at least in France and elsewhere, for 7 years, the only version available to readers was the German one, which you see here, which in a way gave credibility to the fact that Le Corbusier was an agent of Germany, where he was considered as an agent of Moscow. So, but it's a very interesting event. The book was finally published early 1930 and had a very rapid success. Gersberger, at the end of October already, writes to Le Corbusier that he has sold 2,000 out of the 3,000 copies printed, despite, of course, the collapse of the German market after the Depression. So the book is an instant success and is exported very widely. I bought my copy for €5.50 in Moscow, where it had arrived in the early 1930s. When supervising the work of Boesiger and Stonnerhoff, Le Corbusier doesn't ignore anything about the previous books with which all of them in the archive here, but with which the architects have published their own production, built or not. He knows very well the monograph on Behrens by Fritz Höber, in which one finds the rowing club Elektra, on which he had worked himself in the office of Behrens. And in the book, there are positive considerations on his first little book, the first little book Jeanneret Le Corbusier wrote on the decorative arts movement in Germany. It is mentioned in the book, so he knew this book very well. He knew also the first monograph published on Perret in 1927, and also the small publication on Frank Lloyd Wright, published by Wasmuth in 1911. Why did he know it so well? I found the evidence in a letter he writes to Perret in 1915. During the war, German books were not to be bought in Paris, so he buys in Switzerland the book on Wright and gives him to Perret. So he had a very good knowledge of all these monographs, not to mention the portfolios with the work of Otto Wagner, and of course not to mention the Quattro Libri by Andrea Palladio, which he had looked and read in particular in 1915 at Paris Bibliothèque Nationale. There were also some precedents in respect to his own work. First attempts at presenting his work, for instance, in Vers une Architecture already in 1920, in the second printing of 24, he had inserted a portfolio of his work. So he had already started documenting his built work and his design. This is what you see on the left. And the very important journal L'Architecture Vivante had started in 27 the publication of a series of portfolios. There will be in the end 7 of them until 1936. And it is important also for him because he begins with L'Architecture Vivante to conceptualize what a book on his work could be. He says that this publication, mentioning the one you see on the right, should be the expression of a spirit of truth and should aspire to get from the pioneers of the new architecture not only the production of synthetical documents, but also the production of details of the works which could be called anatomical. So in a way, he's pleading for a type of publication which go into the detail of their work. But the complete work, as published in this context, is, of course, far from being objective and seems to be more a sort of narrative, based on a narrative posture. In this first volume, which talks about the chronicle of 2 decades of production, the word of Le Corbusier himself is limited to the introduction, as a sort in the mood of the confidence. It is in the book the only text which is written at in the first person. The rest is written in a more objective matter. And projects are shown in a very impersonal matter, using quotes from his articles and books. The initial intention of the young architects to ask explications on the work of Le Corbusier by various politicians and by the poet Paul Valéry has been forgotten. Works anterior to 1920 are almost completely absent. Here you see how the book starts. The book starts with a view of Le Corbusier in Moscow in 1928 as an expert, showing already to the Russians his books. And on the right you see that what the only images left of Jeanneret's first work between 1906 and 1920 are the sketches of his journey to the East, which will not be published which will never be published as a book during his lifetime. And his very important and significant and touching buildings, for instance, Villa Falais, his first building of 1906, built at the age of 20, and the very significant and very contradictory Villa Schwob are completely missing. So Le Corbusier, in a way, completely rewrites his own genealogy. And we could make a parallel, for instance, with Mies van der Rohe. When Mies van der Rohe has his first major exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1947, in the catalogue by Philip Johnson, there is only one pre-1920 building. It's his project for the Kröller-Müller house, a project for which he was, by the way, in competition with Peter Behrens. So if many projects for social housing are, for instance, completely forgotten, what is not forgotten are the main buildings. And it's interesting to see, for instance, that Le Corbusier tries to give a genealogy of some of his projects. So this is a plate with the Villa La Roche, the famous double Villa La Roche-Jeanneret in Paris, where he explains the transformation of the project, at least with drawings. So it's already a sort of design history of some of his points. And it's also, of course, a book in which his big slogans are given much space. These are the famous 5 points of a new architecture, which had been written on the occasion of the Stuttgart Weissenhof exhibition of 1927, and which are here published in German. And also on the right, this very important explanation, reflexive explanation of his house types of the 1920s, the 4 compositions that go from La Roche, Villa La Roche on the top, to Villa Savoie at the bottom, which was still in the stage of design at that time. This appears for the first time in the œuvre complète. The œuvre complète will become, or the gesamtes Werk as it is still called in German for several years, becomes an instrument in the presentation of in a retrospective presentation of the design, but also in the propagation of the built work. Very, very few buildings in the first one, more and more as times will develop. Le Corbusier also uses the book as a sort of medium, and it is very interesting. For instance, this is a German story. When Le Corbusier participates in 1957 to the famous competition Hauptstadt Berlin. The story is very interesting because Walter Gropius is in the jury, so he tries to push on Gropius to get the job, and Gropius is so annoyed that he resigns from the jury in order not to be compromised. But when Le Corbusier finally gives his project, he forbids the Senatsverwaltung from Berlin from publishing it in the book documenting the competition, saying, I will keep the exclusivity to myself and the œuvre complète. So the œuvre complète becomes a sort of exclusive medium for some of these projects. What about the form of the book? It's a very interesting book. As you've seen, it's a horizontal book. Now it would be called landscape in the new language of the computer age. In the old age in Paris, it was called format à l'italienne, Italian side size format. Look at the sketch on the left. It's a very important little sketch of 1917. In 1917, Le Corbusier works on a book which will never published, and I've devoted to this unpublished and even partly unwritten book a little volume. This book is called France or Germany ? And the book was meant to be a double album documenting the history of architecture and design in France and Germany on two parallel pages, which would have used the color of respective flags. So you see this little sketch. This book will never be completed because the war will end, but was clearly a very important stage in Le Corbusier's move towards the production of books. And it's probably a project which also was in his mind when he helped Siegfried Giedion on the right to write and publish his very important book called Building in France, Bouwen in Frankreich, Bouwen in Eisen, Bouwen in Eisenbeton. And what is interesting, and again, it's a document which is not directly related to the history of the œuvre complète. Giedion sends his book, Bouwen in Frankreich, to the publisher of Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier says, no, I don't want to publish it in my collection, but it could be the beginning. This book, with a rather large size, could motivate the creation of a new collection. This collection could have a very useful format to publish architectural documents, plans and sections, and could be fed rather soon by an entire literature which emerges spontaneously and which would touch the great audience while architectural specialized journals only speak to architects. So the idea of changing the side of the book was already in Le Corbusier's mind. He also knew other books. For instance, Walter Gropius had sent him the catalogue of the exhibition held at the in Weimar in 1923. He had participated to the part of this exhibition called Internationale Architektur, so he knew this book very well. He has it in his, it's still in his library. And he will use then in the book, together again with Tonorov and Ziger and through the agency of Pierre Jeanneret, he will use this book to make a series of demonstrations. And I'm just, the photos are here not very convincing, but I just want to insist on what you see on the right with these 4 images of the cookhouse. The book is probably one in which Le Corbusier's interest for cinematography, for the filmic depiction of buildings, is appearing through a series of systematic sequences that take the reader through what Le Corbusier had started calling the architectural promenade. So this book has, in my view, a very important role in giving a dynamic perception of what architecture could do. So now, and I don't want to be too long, after volume 1 in 1932, a second volume is published by Boesiger alone. Stoneroff is now in America in 1934. You see here the cover of this second volume. And we see with this volume and the following ones, the role the complete works play in Le Corbusier's polemics with the world. One of the most hilarious page of volume 2 is this page where you see on the upper left corner the Errázuriz house designed for the Chilean resort of Zapallar in 1930, a very important project with its inverted V-shaped roof which reflects the profile of the mountains in the back, and I've been there, I can tell you it's exactly right. Le Corbusier did not build the house, but Antonín Raymond, a Czech architect then active in Tokyo, who had worked with Frank Lloyd Wright and who had copied Wright, then copied Perret, copied Le Corbusier, and he built the house with his own means, using the same ideas, the same design, but using bamboo and straw and Japanese materials. And Le Corbusier uses the œuvre complète to say, the title is Pas la peine de se gêner. Why would you bother? Pas la peine de se gêner. And at the same time returns the situation by saying, well, Mr. Raymond has demonstrated that my project was right. So a little later in the third volume, interestingly, is published, is edited by Max Bill and no longer Boesiger. So it's an exception of the series. And Bill publishes Le Corbusier's project. In this case, Le Corbusier uses the œuvre complète to reconstruct, I'm very polite here, to reconstruct the developments that had taken place in Rio de Janeiro in the development of the Ministry of Education. Le Corbusier had participated to the competition in 1936 during his second trip to Rio, but later the project was built, designed and built by Lucio Costa, Oscar Niemeyer, Afonso Reidi and other young Brazilian architects. But Le Corbusier claimed authorship and said, this is my project. So he took credit for this project. So as you see, the œuvre complète was a mean for him, a mean for the defense of his position as an author. Also a mean for defending his rights, for claiming his rights in other messy situation. This is the volume that got published in 58, in which he, in 52, sorry, dated wrong, in 52, it's in which Le Corbusier publishes his design for the United Nations and even his sketchbook to say that Wallace Harrison had stolen his idea. In fact, it wasn't, again, it was not fully his idea. The final design of the building committee was a design by Le Corbusier and Niemeyer. And Niemeyer hardly forgave Le Corbusier for having done that. The œuvre complète also becomes, at a very early stage, an instrument in Le Corbusier's propaganda to convince and seduce the elites. He has, at the time of the first publication, this is the book. You see the book with a soft cover, a soft cardboard cover. But he writes to Gersberger that he needs hard copies to send them to grands personnages, to great figures. So he tries to use the book as a propaganda mean. and sending it to rather problematic people like Son Excellence, His Excellency Benito Mussolini. So this is the dedication in which he congratulates Mussolini for having trusted the young architects, for giving credit and for giving jobs to the young architects. It's a moment, 34, in which he's in Rome, and he tries to organize an evening with slides, with the Duce and slides, to show him his ideas for the new towns of the regime. So you see, this role, this book has, in a way, it's a sort of pivotal instrument which works retroactively, which works as a sort of act of memorialization at the same time as an act of publicity. And he will constantly send the book and his other books to lots of people. The book is not discussed, interestingly, since it's published in German. It's not discussed in the French press, almost not. The only discussion of French press, curiously, is done by a young German architect by the name of Julius Posener, who Julius is in Paris at that time, and he's the only one to mention it. Otherwise, it's discussed by Nikolaus Pevsner, here by Max Raphael, in a very interesting way. Pevsner is very skeptical and acknowledges what he calls the spatial fantasy of Le Corbusier, but inscribes it in a genealogy that goes back to the 19th century and giving credit to the Germans and the Dutch. So Raphael has a more sophisticated quasi-Marxist analysis, which I won't discuss today. So finally, in 1937, after 7 years, the book is published in French. And it took a long time. And the book develops, the series develops. I won't comment on each issue. I will just mention the last one here, which was published after the death of Le Corbusier in 1965 by Bösiger, and in which you find one of the most enigmatic projects of Le Corbusier, his Museum of the 20th Century, which was meant to be built at La Défense. At the same time, the book has continued his life, through also changing publishers, but had become a sort of canon for architectural books. And very briefly, I would mention the canon used by Le Corbusier himself, the idea of these long albums, which might have to do with sketchbooks he had used in the early 1920s. If we go back to the origin of this, Le Corbusier was making watercolors on sketchbooks which were like this. So anyway, the Radiant City, Des Canons des Munitions in 1938, is still in 1956 his sort of recapitulation of his plans for Paris, Les Plans de Paris. This canon will be used by many other people. Sotzgorod, a book which was discussed here by my old friend Hartmut Frank some time ago. Sotzgorod by Miliut is published by Miliut in Moscow. And again, as I told you, I bought my copy in Moscow. The Russians knew it very well, probably better than the French, because they were importing all the books from Germany around 1930. And on the right, someone who was, of course, affiliated with Le Corbusier and had worked with him, who had become the chair of Harvard's, will become the chair of Harvard's architectural school and was teaching there beginning in the early 40s. José Luis Sert used this format to publish a book which was in a way based on the discussions of the 1933 Siam in Athens. As for the architects, they will widely use the canon after the war. Richard Neutra, Building and Projects, published in 1950, also by Giersberger. So architects will go see Giersberger and ask him, Mr. Giersberger, please make our complete works. Alto, also Giersberger, later in 1963. And even Lursa, this is a sort of homage of vice to virtue. Lursa, who had been at the origin of the book and had failed to have his book published in the same series, would would publish his own work in the same horizontal format around 1960. So, and now let's get back to the founding trio, Gersberger, Bösiger, and Le Corbusier, and my equation, Gersberger plus Bösiger plus Corbu equals the complete works. The complete works were widely used as a didactic tool, and I'm over in a minute. Essentially after 1945, they were forbidden before. Important to know that in many schools of architecture in Europe, the books of Le Corbusier were forbidden. In Rome, Giovannoni had them excised from the library. The Russians took them away, the Germans also. At the École des Beaux-Arts, before 45, it was, so the books had a sort of subversive character. After 45, in a way, the complete works replaces the teaching that Le Corbusier doesn't accept to deliver himself, since he rejects the idea of teaching at the École des Beaux-Arts. And in his preface of 1957, to his conversation with the students from the schools of architecture, just after having seen Bösiger again, as you see on this image, on the occasion of his exhibition, in Le Corbusier, on his exhibition in Zurich, he defined his vision of architectural pedagogy on the base of the book. And he wrote, I will read this quote, the only long quote here, but it's, I think, a very important one. In 1927, un enseignement Corbu, a Corbu education, spontaneous, was created with the publication of the complete works in Zurich by Willy Bösiger. This remarkable kid was a young architect. 30 years have passed on his hair, as you see here, as on mine. I had defined a line of conduct. No celebration, no literary explosion. On the contrary, an impeccable documentation. It was here, all the plans, all the sections, all the elevations, providing the biology and the rigorous anatomy of the works considered. Explanatory text, detailed captions, the necessary dimensions, etc. Bösiger, with the œuvre complète, Bösiger has created a modern demonstration of education. End quote. And it is very clear that people who tried to and succeeded in renovating architectural education would base their work largely on the Unité in those years, in the 50s and 60s. I'm thinking of Colin Rowe, of course, here. I'm thinking of Peter Eisenman, who was a student of Rowe, and who tells the story. It's an interesting anecdote that when Le Corbusier died in August 1965, he, Peter Eisenman, with Michael Graves and other students from the School of Architecture, or young teachers, they were young teachers, at the School of Architecture in Princeton, Xeroxed the œuvre complète and glued it with Scotch tape on all the windows of the School of Architecture. So in a way created a Xerox mausoleum with Le Corbusier using the œuvre complète. So, in short, you understand that this book has become a very important and a very significant machine, and remains a source of inspiration. So, I will end on a personal note. I'm currently working on a publication of the sketches of Frank Gehry. Also a landscape format book, and this came out of logically because many of Frank's sketches are horizontal, not the ones you see here on this provisional layout. And I've realized that in dividing his works into volumes, I had come to a number of 8 volumes, so that in a way, unselfconsciously, the canon was still working even in the digital age. But this will be, of course, a very different story with very different architecture than the one which has taken, as you see, the dimension of a sort of legend. Thank you.
Well, I think that well, I thank immensely to Sophia Ungers allowing me to be here tonight, and I am overwhelmed by being in this house and seeing so carefully kept this such an intense life as an architect as Oswald Matthias Ungers had, and I think this is quite touching to see that this house, which has kept so many wishes and so many impulses about architecture, to be alive with this kind of meetings, of this one, of a couple of friends and people reading together some books. I ought to start saying that I believe pertinent to speak today about Delirious New York. First, because at the end, everybody knows how much the career of Rem Koolhaas starts associated with Ungers at Cornell, and even how much his earlier projects have to do with the direction that have learned from Ungers in Cornell in his very first projects. And also, I ought to say that this is pertinent as well because, in a way, the book of Delirious New York, having reread again so carefully as I am able to do, ought to be seen almost as a manifesto, clearly as a manifesto, just to try to be clearly opposed to this anti-Manhattanism that he believes to happen in Le Corbusier. In a way, the Delirious New York has been read almost like the kind of New York urban history, or just helping people to walk.
Wait, 1 second. Nobody understands.
Because the book ought to be read, I am sure, almost sure, just following what Ren says from the very beginning, that the book is a retroactive manifesto in favor of Manhattan, because he believed that what Le Corbusier has done is just, trying to promote this kind of rationalism. This is embedded with this idealism upheld by the Cartesian rationalism, but instead it is the realism that is behind Manhattan, this realism associated with both masses, pragmatism and capitalism, money, what that at the end forges a new kind of rationalism that is interested on instead of this much more idealistic, preconceived idea of the world that Le Corbusier has. And therefore, when you go to the book as this manifesto, you ought to end up seeing the book almost as this attempt to oppose so clearly as possible to Le Corbusier, and he does that with New York. I think that it's pertinent also to speak about Koolhaas and Le Corbusier, because no matter how has clearly lack of sympathy toward what Le Corbusier ideas means, Koolhaas is, as has been, as Jean-Louis have said, is a clear example of about how architecture has been disseminated even since the Renaissance, just trying architects to take the help of the wars for explaining and for making this proselytism with the architectural ideas they have. And therefore, if some architect nowadays has followed this behavior pattern of Le Corbusier is Koolhaas, in spite of this attempt to be away from Le Corbusieranism. So I will try to read with you the way I did the book, and I will try to take help as much as I can from the direct quotes of the book. The book is powerfully written and quite, let's say, he coins from time to time so rightful description of the situation they is trying to say. In a way, I would say that the literary style of Koolhaas is very effective and is difficult. Don't be, let's say, attached to it as much as we can. And so when I am talking about the manifesto, from the very beginning, they say how to write a manifesto on a form of urbanism that was remains of the 20th century in an age disgusted with them. At the end of 20th century, anybody wanted, or so thought Koolhaas, anybody wanted to hear any more about manifestos. The fatal weakness of manifestos is their inherent lack of evidence. Manhattan's problem is the opposite. It is a mountain range of evidence without manifestos. This book was conceived as the first intersection of these two observations. It is a retroactive manifesto for Manhattan. Manhattan is the 20th century Rosetta Stone. And very rapidly in these introductory pages, he enters what actually is one of the strengths of his argument, and is this of congestion. Because he said, don't be afraid about just, let's say, a utopic way of describing the city. The city enjoys and it takes its energy just rightly because of this congestion that is what Manhattan has discovered to be in the true roots of something that could be seen as the most lively city in the world. Manhattan is the one urbanistic ideology that has fed from its own conception on the splendors of miseries of the metropolitan condition, hyperdensity. Manhattan's architecture is a paradigm for the exploitation of congestion. Congestion is actually what drives Manhattan. And he wants to say, or to speak about Manhattan just for explaining how this idealistic Le Corbusier approach doesn't work. And he will do that with this book that once, so clearly he says, organized and structured the way the blocks in the grids of Manhattan are. And these pages say that very clearly. In terms of structure, this book is a simulacrum of Manhattan's grid, a collection of blocks whose proximity and juxtaposition reinforce their separate meanings. The first, and now comes to describe these blocks, and he does that very, very clearly. I think he speaks something about prehistory. Prehistory, and obviously he goes through a very, let's say, loose history of what the urban development of New York was, and so they speak of the commissioners, and goes on immediately in just speaking of something that could look like anecdotal, and yet it is quite consistent to make his point, and is the talking about Coney Island, that is, let's say, a thematic, pre-thematic park that the New Yorkers built in the second half of 19th century. This Coney Island block is the first chapter, and we will need to say something about that. We will move very rapidly about it, but it should be mentioned that it is quite mandatory for because it makes one of the main points that Rem uses for explaining Manhattan. The second one is the skyscraper, perhaps the core of the book, when he explains how he sees the skyscrapers and how they developed since the beginning of 20th century till the 30s, till the construction of the Rockefeller Center. The third chapter is and we will pay attention to that mostly because it explains and it ends just, let's say, saying what he wants to say about how is a city made with the help of a skyscraper and what is behind a skyscraper, which theory of architecture is behind a skyscraper. The third chapter is the Rockefeller Center, that is a beautiful chapter, but could be said that is more historical. We will move more rapidly about it. It is quite enticing, and he ends just saying something that is very important, that the city itself is so powerful that at the end, when it goes a bit far away from the plot of land in the block, when it takes 3 or 4 blocks together in the city, the design by committee is able to produce such fantastic or splendorous episode of architecture as the Rockefeller is. And the fourth, and he put that just at the end, is this what he calls Europeans in New York, those Europeans that are Dalí and Le Corbusier. He obviously bets in favor of the more let's say, more, I would say even real, more, that is the version that Dalí gives of this attempt to control consciously the unconscious, and Le Corbusier almost as somebody who actually works always with these preconceived ideas of this utopian way of living. Obviously, he's very much in favor of this much more broken reality and yet more closer to what actually the things are. I would say that the first chapters are just ending in the fourth one, and the fourth one is when he describes exactly what he would like done to be done and what he finds in Manhattan. He offers first Manhattan achievements and how Manhattan has produced them, and then later shows what actually he wouldn't like it to happen, and makes this example of the reaction towards New York of these two figures, Dalí and Le Corbusier. Afterwards, some chapter that he called post-mortem, that speaks about the Harrison and Abramovich and all those architects that came afterwards. And then later, and again, some images of his projects between 1975 and 1980 or 1987, that is when the book was published. I think that it's important to consider that the book is mostly about this clear target of being a manifesto than being an urban history of New York, because at the end the book was through this explanation of Manhattan without having a single quote to the Chicago School of Architecture, or without talking about the previous cast iron buildings, or just talking about the infrastructure features that are so mandatory for explaining New York, either the subway or the tunnels or the bridges and so on. And at the end, he centers his view in this first third of the 20th century, that is when this new type or new way, better than the new type, that this new way of thinking in how to build and what could be said, his thoughts about an architectural theory of what buildings are, that is what skyscrapers do. Then I put together these 10 pages. It's important for him, this, he says, these images, the book is very rich and obviously ought to be valued, the research that Koolhaas did. Obviously it's not first-hand fountains materials. Everything has been taken from existing books and from this collection of postcards he put together. And yet he handled and he manipulated that, making this articulate argument and for just writing Manhattan history, almost like a manifesto. And therefore he started showing this view of New York in early 1850s, and when New York replicated the London Victorian exhibition with some kind of attempt of doing the same, and then he comes later on with and comes almost immediately with this Coney Island, to which it gives such an important Coney Island. I think that this image is quite important to find out how he sees that people living in New York that at the end touches and connects with the other side of the Atlantic, allowing themselves to build up whatever they would like to do. This is an island that for those who live in such a remote geography as is the other side of the Atlantic are able to rescue what they don't have, just building there and alluding to all European history of whatever sense of being surrounded by pleasures that he would like to have. And therefore he shows here Coney Island almost related with the bridges, Manhattan and Williamsburg and so on, and coming directly there. Obviously, Coney Island should be quite the peculiar, let's say, place where developers try to give people and masses all that they wanted to feel close by, and therefore he connects in a very efficient way, or at least I didn't know anything about that, the figures of let's say these first developers, these gentlemen called those three gentlemen, Frederick Thompson, Elmer Dundy, William Reynolds, and so on. That doesn't matter so much. Those are developers who actually are able to create these big complexes. There is a Staple Chase is the first one, and then the Luna Park is the second one, and the Dreamland is the third one. And look at this very touching image of how people moving to Coney Island, masses that wants to go there, to feel what the city is able to give them. And they are the most bizarre experiences from, let's say, simulacrum of race horses artificially running around, or just people moving toward these gigantic wheels of those Russian mountains, or just whatever kind of fantasies that even just the fire brigade able to go down with a fictitious fire, and everything was able to happen there. And beside that, the issue of business. It seems that at the end of the century, somebody thought that this, obviously when you come to that, you are able to find out even the building of Rem for just crossing the British Channel when communications happen below, and then the big sphere is able to keep and to hold all life. At the end, buildings becomes almost like complete cities, and they say the perfect sphere is the perfect sphere that keeps, in terms of the most materialistic reality, the largest volume in the smallest surface is split, and then this almost Eiffel Tower piers going up and divided, and then you have a racehorse above, and you have a garden above, and it means that they are sectioning horizontally the sphere, just putting there the most disparate programs. Is not just by chance that was almost something offered to private investors, and that people bought their shares thinking that would be the best of the business. That didn't happen, and in 1906 it seems that, I'm sorry, in 1906 it failed, and then this Globe Tower, in which people had put so many hopes, didn't go ahead. And then almost at the same time, two tremendous fires, those who had been playing with the fictitious fires, just to show how we were able to dominate fire. Then it fell down, and it was first the Dreamland, who was completely burned down, and then later the Luna Park, and then what had been in the let's say the end of 19th century, this sense of pleasant place where New Yorkers could find out all what they were lacking or missing, was out and was almost falling in complete decay. Why Koolhaas pays so much attention to this episode? I think that for two reasons. First, because probably in this, let's say, capricious way of raising buildings, able to hold the most diverse programs, that anticipates this sense that big buildings, skyscrapers, are able to contain this diversity that at the end is the base of the richness of Manhattan has. Buildings are able to hold its own size, the ability to convey and to keep in one single construction all the richness of life, all the richness of this, even of this artificial sense of life that actually characterize what Manhattan is going to be. And second, because it seems that some of the developers that have been active in Coney Island moved later on to Manhattan, and therefore they knew how to deal, and their seeds are in the origin of what was happening with Manhattan. Therefore, it's a chapter that could look like almost, let's say, presentable, and yet it is a solid piece for making the argument that he wanted to do. Coney Island anticipates this concept of lobotomy, this concept of just not standing on, this sense of consistency or coherence with this idea that the building is something that has the entity of life being that has its own structure. The idea of the structure that is, let's say, enjoying the congruency and enjoying consistency that ends up in form, and that was pursued by architectural theories from after the Renaissance, and still is alive in Le Corbusier, when he wants this perfect society. From the very beginning, Rem Koolhaas thinks and tries to show us that life is much more disparate and that buildings should accept this disparity. I think that he enters then in just saying something about the skyscraper, and is where the strength of the book resides. I would say that perhaps are the most effective pages for who wanted to know what he thinks about the skyscraper. And he starts saying, even though he doesn't say anything about Chicago, about those who have explored more carefully the steel structure, in the beginning of the century, somebody was offering this idea of a building of 80 floors, able to hold whatever kind of programs, almost just making this garden city, vertical garden city, allowing this, let's say, this built structure to hold the most different programs. And therefore, he speaks about that theorem, says skyscraper, a slender steel structure supports 84 horizontal planes, all the size of the original plot. Each of these artificial levels is treated as a virgin site, as if the other did not exist, to establish a strictly private realm around a single country house. Well, this sense that each floor or each level could live independently of the others, that the building shouldn't be seen in Albertian terms as this kind of unity, unable to take out any part of it, is what he discovered from the very beginning, and goes on speaking about all that with since each of these sites is to meet its own particular programmatic destiny outside the control of the architect, the skyscraper is the instrument of a new town of unknowable urbanism. In spite of its physical solidity, the skyscraper is the great metropolitan destabilizer. It promises perpetual programmatic instability. That is what he is looking for, and is what he finds is happening throughout these early or these years around the First World War. Is happening with different types of skyscraper, from those that takes directly the plan of the block, the plan of the plot and goes up as the flat iron, from those others that are trying to exploit as much as they can the surface. He is just, I wondered, and sorry, and I don't believe that I should read all these small pieces. He speaks about the camouflage, or he speaks about the triumph when in this branch of utopian real estate, because he sees this attempt of extruding from the plan all the vertical volume that's possible. He sees that almost as something that has the value of the pressure of money, of the pressure masses and value of money, of capitalism, is what is responsible at the end of this actual reality that the city is. And this branch of utopian real estate, architecture is no longer the art of designing buildings so much as the brutal skyward extrusion of whatever site the developer has managed to assemble. And that and goes through from now on, each new building of the mutant kind strives to be a city within the city. The truculent ambition makes the metropolis a collection of architectural city-states, all potentiality at work with it, all potentiality at work with each other. Buildings are seen as this; they are not anymore forming. And then he describes now some different ways of dealing with the, let's say, with architecturizing the skyscraper, and therefore he speaks about the tower, or he speaks and talking about about the tower. He ends up in the Woolworth, this building by Cass Gilbert. That it is true that when one starts to think about this let's say continuous borrowing between arbitrariness and just attempt to erase this sense of basing architecture in some arbitrarily established statement or principle, the skyscraper went very rapidly into the tower. From these towers, the World War is one of the best known, and obviously that there is a radical way of replicating let's say the Venetian campanile with the clock, that is the Metropolitan Tower. And he speaks also about what he calls just an extension of the tower by one hand, and then later talking about the block alone. When he talks about the block alone, he talks about things like that. That is Stanford White from McKean White. McKean and White, McKean and White, yes, thank you. McKean and White, I don't know, that should be the years, because so familiar as I have been with all them. But is Stanford White here, one of McKean and White, making an entire block, and from an entire block, just borrowing from historical styles. In this case, La Giralda from Seville, it is taken directly. And then later, even somebody who was asking to somebody like Gaudí, making skyscraper, something is known. It's not, it wasn't a discovery, but it was quite perceptive by Rem using somebody like Gaudí, where this hotel, he discovers again this, let's say, he puts the rooms all all around this big bullet, and then later the boy does an atrium, and above a big auditorium, and then later the meeting hall, and then later that means that he starts to even though doesn't has the flexibility Rem is looking for later on, but even somebody like Gaudí realized that the iconic wrapping of the building was able to hold whatever. And then this sense that the city, what remain of Coney Island, he is just making or just writing pages here about or emphasizing how much this sense that the city should provide whatever human mind could think about, and therefore those who wanted to think about the lack of history were able to live together in this let's say fictitious Roman spaces that provide all what the fantasy of what Roman culture has achieved, was able to be held in New York, and was able to be held with this very, let's say, quite different. We are just in 1920s, quite different from the art decoratives in Europe. I mean, in the moment when Europe is much more still basing what they want to do in the avant-garde, even in this formalism that comes from the artist exploration. It seems that this transatlantic world was more able to see in pleasure and histories expressionable in quite a different way from just figurative art only. And then immediately after it comes that, because, well, that is a theatrical effect. No, in 1916, it happens this, I have shown you one of the images, the building in downtown by Graham, the firm of architects, who was out of whatever respectable. And then people, they start to speak about shadows and speak about the rights of those who were damaged by those big buildings. And then in 1916, it was established the law that lately seems to be responsible of the shape that we Europeans admire so much. And it came just saying you would be able to use 25% of the plot, just able to go up whatever you want to do, but all the 75% resting should be kept, some kind of normatives, so some kind of restrictions. And then it happens that ought to be seen not anymore as another cathedral tower, but just showing that the central 25 could go up and all the others should be just growing up, keeping some kind of slopes for preventing people of falling in the shadow. And that happens, and it will happen with the appearance of somebody that should be capricious, but and yet and now he's mixing the, let's say, the history of the skyscrapers themselves with the history of those who forged them, and among them is the perspectivist called Hugh Ferris. This Hugh Ferris that makes here for the city some drawings interpreting the new mandatory norm, does also this version, and it starts and it's going to draw perspectives for almost everybody since the 20s till we will see some drawing at the end that he made for Le Corbusier for the United Nations building, where he has been just giving the shape, advancing the shape to whoever architect. I mean, he worked for all of the architects, no matter who were, and therefore Koolhaas calls him the city pilot, no, the piloto automático, the automatic pilot, the man who actually was able to say what the application of the norm and draw that was this Hugh Ferris. Here he's in the 30s, and here some examples of how to deal, instead of just with the independent block, instead of just thinking in the single skyscraper. Here we're going to see some actions on blocks, this action from the Empire States, and he tells the story of that, something about the Waldorf Astoria, the hotel buildings that are just working entirely in a block. And then here this image that somehow summarized how things were at the beginning of in the middle 30s, because the empire was finished. The empire started to be built with the Depression and ended up a bit later than expected in 1932-33. And then that was the image of just when the skyscraper has established in a way the canon of how to be built. And Koolhaas summarizes that in this building, that is a building from 1931, the Athletic Club, and here in a very, let's say, effective, diagrammatic way, shows what the skyscraper is about. A skyscraper, if Le Corbusier has been talking about the free plan and saying you could move freely in the plan, he's saying what the skyscraper allows is just to move freely in the section, but the section is not anymore imposing the shape of the building. The building runs from one side and the interior runs from the other. You're able to do with it what you would like to do. Is this this paranoid split between interior and exterior, what obviously has been one of the key issues. Really, all the theories about organic architecture, all the theories trying to give value to the let's say the structure of the building itself, we're always asking for this continuity interior exterior. Now he says that doesn't happen, and that is what the skyscraper introduces for working in the city, and is what this section shows so clearly. All what he has said is summarized here, and we are able to find out in a much more, let's say, not so scandalously way. We are not seeing there big ballrooms or auditoriums. Instead, the building keeps this and lives comfortably with this, let's say, diversity of programs that characterize, as I said, the urban life. Now he starts to talk about those who are responsible of these buildings. This is a ball in New York, 1931. Are the well-known architects in the middle, Van Halen, who was the architect of the Chrysler, but quite different. You think about the image of all the signers of the CIM is quite different approach. Here are those builders that are related with developers and with this, let's say, pressure of masses looking for make money and just taking advantage of this instrument that is the Manhattan grid. And among those, let's say, responsible is, for instance, this William Corbett, is a very respectable gentleman, for whom somebody like Ferris again drew this kind of Venetian version that they anticipate, and they want, is what Koolhaas said, to exploit this congestion by the, let's say, establishing this Venetian difference between the cars below and the people above, and therefore this, let's say, this way of, is above, this way of making arcades and making passages that later we're able to see in cities like Hong Kong or the same Atlanta, no, where some kind of division between communication and pedestrian, and then the figure of Raymond Hood, who was who was taught as in the Beaux-Arts School of Architecture in Paris, who won the competition of the Chicago Tribune, and ends in New York immediately in the early 20s, and who actually realized that buildings could stand by themselves, and he establishes this kind of curious sketch where he sees the grid not anymore as blocks, but much more as this kind of isolated pieces, something that obviously doesn't work so well, even though he later on tries to concentrate in the corners this construction, something that is there, and there what he did as a sketch for working in the Rockefeller Center. In a way, it can be said that this sketch by this gentleman, Corbett, was also his contribution for the Rockefeller Center, and Raymond Hood's contribution was this other, with this clay model, much more vibrant, something different. But what comes out from this very readable chapter on the Rockefeller Center is an idea that also helps him to give value to the city as a whole. And he's saying, well, an operation like this one, because of the immanent, let's say, principles that the city has, it can be designed by committee. And that means that all those architects here, those who actually are got together, but they are not got together because stylistic reasons, as it was the message and what Le Corbusier was trying to sell and was trying to promote with the CIAM, but that the city itself is what is able to put together to all these architects for making such a remarkable piece of urban design and the city as the Rockefeller is. Now we have entered in the latest chapter, that this chapter on Le Corbusier. We are just jumping a couple of, let's say, more anecdotal episodes on somebody like Diego Rivera and things like actually doesn't deserve to pay so much attention. But instead, I think that whenever we talk about this early Koolhaas, we need to talk about his wife, about Madelon Breisendorf, who, and it's something that he recognizes in the book as well. I mean, it's quite wonderful to read after just talking to those that has helped to him, and among the names, very well-known names, for instance, Pierre Apraxin, Hubert Damisch, Peter Eisenman, Dick Frank, Philip Johnson, Andrew McNair, many of them surely quite well known by Jean-Louis, Lorinda Spear, Fred Starr, James Stirling, well, this list, and then later, above all, Delirious New York owes a special depth of inspiration and reinforcement to Madelon Breisendorf. And it's true that probably his wife was very close to him, even, I wouldn't say about all those images, but surely that those images couldn't happen without a very extended conversation. And obviously you need to look at the images above. The images above are just making these fantasies from the, let's say, the solitude in a train and in tunnel to the cave, almost in idyllic conditions, to what happens from one Manhattan window, and all what happens for the city living under, and all this mixture that is much more close to this uncontrollable, unconscious that Dalí wanted to do. And therefore, here starts this latest chapter where he clearly established what he would like the city to be, that this exactly the opposite, or just the clear opposition to Le Corbusier thoughts is what comes in this chapter. And then he says in the middle 30s, Le Corbusier and Dalí arrived to New York. Both of them had quite different reactions. And then he says, in the mid-30s, both Salvador Dalí and Le Corbusier, they hate each other, visit New York for the first time. Both conquer it. Dalí conceptually through interpretative appropriation. New York, why did you create my statue long ago, long before I was born? Le Corbusier, the skyscrapers are too small, and therefore Le Corbusier proposed himself to destroy it. Their reactions, diametrically opposite, are episodes fueled by equal parts jealousy and admiration in the long history of Europeans' attempts to reclaim Manhattan. Both claims that he would like to do and to be Manhattan, but in different reasons. I think that Dalí comes with this sense that the paranoid method of just including all what people want above whatever kind of norm, about whatever restriction imposed by language, and then Le Corbusier just a bit the opposite, who comes to New York, and even though he probably admires and would like to be there and to work there, he still resists the skyscraper in this curious way. In the left, you see La Tour Saint-Jacques, Le Moyen Âge de Paris, une université américaine qui le croirait, quel jet d'enfants. Sorry. In this page from the book of Koolhaas, he says here that is the authentic. That is what is an authentic. That is the play of children who makes this kind of the formal plays with Gothic, but isn't what actually. Then if we read, but these are, let me read directly Koolhaas, because so I am not just making, let's say, own interpretation. But these are mere fingers exercises. It is Le Corbusier's all-consuming ambition to invent and build the new city commensurate with the demands and potential glories of the machine civilization. It is his tragic bad luck that such a city already exists when he develops this ambition, namely Manhattan. It was called Manhattan. Le Corbusier's task is clear. Before he can deliver the city with which he is pregnant, the city that he wants to think about, he has to prove that it does not yet exist. He says the city that he wants to do, he has found that in New York, but he needs to destroy this city to be able to explain and to pose to the eyes of the others the city that he would like to do. To establish the birth date of his brainchild, he has to destroy New York's credibility, kill the glamorous sparkle of its modernity. From 1920, he fights on two fronts simultaneously, waging a systematic campaign of ridicule and defamation against the American skyscraper and his natural habitat, Manhattan, while carrying out a parallel operation of actually designing the anti-skyscraper and the anti-Manhattan. Well, that is what he wants to say, and then therefore he illustrates an image like that. He illustrates an image like that, saying, "Identikit portrait of Le Corbusier, imaginary New York." Quotes from Le Corbusier: "Living in order to work. This means breaking our backs, driving ourselves mad, moral bewilderment, a prodigious hiatus between us and the realities of nature, plunging into a black abyss of artificiality. Some men have grouped themselves together. Why? In order to struggle for improving your lives, in order to suffer." He sees New York not just as this ideal city that he's looking for. He sees New York clearly as something that he doesn't think that should be followed, should be, and therefore, let me see where he comes now. I'm sorry. Wait. And therefore, when he comes here, he says, well, top half. Le Corbusier's passionate involvement with New York is, in fact, a 15 years long attempt to cut an umbilical cord. In spite of his angry obliterations, he is secretly nourished by his reservoir of precedents and models. When he finally introduced his anti-skyscraper, he is like a prestidigitator who accidentally gives his trick away. He makes the American skyscraper disappear in the black velvet patch of his speculative universe, adds the jungle, nature in his purest possible form, then shakes up the incompatible elements of his paranoid critical top hat, and surprise pulls out the horizontal skyscraper, Le Corbusier's Cartesian rabbit. That is what, and then you see here, that is how the people struggle when they believe that they want only to work. He would like this work to be the east with the jungle, with nature, and he says the building that I would like to do is that is what comes out of this mixture of these two things. We are just arriving the bit to the end. We could follow up just reading pages in which he explains that this way. Obviously, you think what he's thinking about. That was till the Middle Age, and that is what Manhattan has done, all the towers and the skyscrapers of Rem and so on. That is tomorrow. Tomorrow should be that. This kind of very very pacified way of dealing with the skyscraper. And then when it happens that at the end of the war he comes together with the others, let's say, assigned architects to make the United Nations, still somebody like Hugh Ferris draws these two drawings in the late 40s, early 50s, and then Ferris writes something like that. As nearly as I could understand things throughout the interpreted, I do not speak French, he insisted that buildings should float. And then Rem is harder that just Hugh Ferris, and he says something about that. The design of the United Nations marks the last significant reappearance of the Master of Darkness. Hugh Ferris is not anymore the Master of Paris, the Master of Darkness. Darkness has disappeared, who is called in to make quick renderings of the various alternatives proposed by the advisors. He is now more than ever a believer in modern architecture, even the poor Ferris. But in spite of this conscious engagement, Ferris' art remains unconsciously critical. The dullness of Le Corbusier's urbanism has never been more ruthlessly exposed than in the modest renderings of Manhattanism automatic pilot. It's very, very strong, but very well done. I mean, I am saying that the literary values of Rem, I would say that it has helped a lot also to communicate and to give people the sense that we have caught something of this very much, let's say, perceptive and quite independent approaches that he always has had. I would say I will coincide with him in just saying that these renderings are indeed showing this tenuous condition of what the slab of the United Nations was, and then he tells that. Obviously, quite different from what it was still the Rockefeller Center, was represented as his best, and then with I would like to end with just reading what he says about this image, that is an image drew by his wife. After the shipwreck in the Mediterranean of the Medusa, a military vessel, the soldiers' castaways were left on their raft with only barrels of wine, guns, and ammunition. In a premature and drunken panic, they began to cannibalize each other on the second day of their journey. Saved on the seventh day of the shipwreck, they could easily have survived without eating anything at all. The monumental expression of loss of nerve corresponds to the premature panic and loss of nerve about the metropolis in the present moment of the 20th century. That is the way Madelon Brainsthorpe represents this, let's say, uncertain moment of when the book is written. And he says, what the pity that the figure of the man is laying in the what remains of this Manhattan grid. Still, the Manhattan grid could be what we have learned from it. It could be able to provide the foundations for this architecture that based in realism and pragmatism and actual life, struggling for money that capitalism and masses, this intersection of capitalism and masses has has ended in materializing what the reality of Manhattan is. Obviously, the manifesto is quite clear. Should we say now that what came out afterwards, such a manifest, is just, let's say, respecting Rem's thoughts? Should we believe that even his own work has been so clearly and so intelligently committed as it has been the description of what he has seen Manhattan? I wouldn't be so sure about it. I think that I have finished. Thank you. From Rem, and probably he has done a very rightful reading of Manhattan. I wonder what the some of the, let's say, results that comes out. For instance, the notion that he has extended in a book like small, medium, large, extra large, that is this idea of bigness, no? That today impregnates so much architecture is or isn't valuable. I would say that not always bigness, it works very often, but we should accept that very often bigness works much more in favor of those economic actors behind that just because the city needs to do it. I think that Rem has talked about this sense of Frankenstein's monsters, and I wonder whether whatever building that actually holds and encloses this liveliness that he discovered in Coney Island is justifies just because it works that it isn't a monster. At the end, we need to be careful about monsters, and I don't believe cities as a collection of monsters works, and therefore to reflect about how much the fact of what has worked in Manhattan and has worked for explaining should be enlarged and extended without a very much more carefully criticism and discussion, I will advocate it because of that, in favor of that. I would like just, let me say something that, curiously, we established the parallel between Le Corbusier and Rem as taking help of words. But it's also true that Rem never has presented his work anymore as this collection of his own work.
Yeah.
Even he has changed the format of whatever he has a new book, he changes the format. I mean, he's intelligent enough for just trying to avoid canon. And under this point of view, I don't know whether he does that or he has done that consciously or unconsciously. But in any case, it is very intelligent that he did that. But in the meanwhile, I don't believe that the new cities to come should be the way the promises of the city of the Gulf, or even a city as London is doing ourselves. I think that we ought to be critical about cities made as this collection of independent buildings. I don't see that the scheme that came out from Raymond Hood of just buildings, the buildings in Manhattan are much better connected by the grid that just left alone. Yeah. And now so many cities are just living with all those buildings as the answer to the cities. I would like to be back and to keep the city as the goal and as the target for starting to think how whatever architectural intervention should be today. But just I had not prepared this end, but could be thought as that. Eh?
Yes, I think the parallel is very interesting. Again, as I said, Rem has established himself with a book which contains some programmatic statements for himself. When he talks precisely of programmatic instability in Manhattan, he will try to promote in his own projects, beginning with, let's mention Euralil, one of the ones he has built, or the Rotterdam set of skyscrapers in Rotterdam. So he has really implemented this program of this strategy of programmatic conflicts, trying to, with a certain phobia of aesthetics and form, and more importantly, a phobia against repetition. So when you were saying that he has not made a collection, that every book is different, it's avoiding to repeat himself. Yeah. Yet, if you try to establish a parallel, you could say that SMLXL, in a way, is the first volume of his complete works. Because it's a collection of projects, which is done, of course, graphically with very different means, in which, like with Le Corbusier, there is a sort of stuffing with manifestos, with very brief manifestos. So in a way, you can make a parallel between Deleuze's New York and Vers une Architektur, except that Le Corbusier is still looking at Athens, even if he starts looking at New York, and on one side, and the complete works and SMLXL on the other side. There are strange missing, to the credit of Rem, he's rediscovering people who were completely forgotten, who were not featured in the main narrative. Someone like Corbett, who has been extremely important as an architect, as an organizer. Ferris also, who was considered simply as an instrument of the architects, and he gives him credit. He is forgetting, for instance, Marcel Duchamp, who had arrived in New York in 1915, and the first statement of Duchamp was, New York is per se a work of art. So he was probably the first European who started considering New York in a sort of positive manner, in a positive and critical manner, and not only as a sort of prodigy of vastness, which was in a sort of sublime spectacle, urban spectacle, which would change the world. So there are all sorts of other aspects and other fetishes of Rem in the book, which is, I think, keeping its validity in many ways today. But it is hardly a program. So I think Rem is clever enough not to be, again, having the anxiety of repeating himself is someone who's constantly in movement, whereas Le Corbusier was trying to work on a more linear manner with his ideas.
Anyway.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.